if you would make sure, thank you, it's been done. Ladies and gentlemen, it's magic, isn't it? It's just all magic. At this point, I'd like to introduce Karen Treiber. Karen Treiber is the chair of the Chippewa Valley Group. She recently was awarded the JJ and Pat Werner Award from the Sierra Club, which recognizes Karen's long period of service to the group and to the John Muir chapter. And many of you may not know that, but she's been our chair for many years. I don't know how many Karen maybe can tell us, but it truly is a great honor for her to receive it. It's a great honor for us to have one of our members be honored in that way. So thank you, Karen, but Karen is going to just say a few words. Karen.
I just wanted to say welcome to the Chippewa Valley Group meeting. Somebody needs to mute themselves too. I can't see who that is, but anyways, I wanted to give credit to both Richard Smith and Jeff Henry. They put this together along with help from Katie Hogan, who is the Wisconsin Sierra Club volunteer coordinator, and again, Elizabeth Ward, who is the chapter director of Wisconsin Sierra Club. She's co-hosting tonight, and this is the first time we've done this, so we appreciate all the help, and it's going to be a great program. I'm really interested in hearing what Ron has to say, so thank you for coming.
Thank you, Karen. In case, I'm going to push the mute all button again. That should take care of anybody who shows up at this point. Hopefully you can hear me. If you are about to speak, you'll have to unmute yourself. Jeff, that might be you. Jeff is going to give us a little bit of information about our next month's program.
Yes, 4 weeks from tonight, Wednesday, March 3rd, we will have our second virtual Chippewa Valley Sierra Club meeting, and it will be with Michael Taboris from the River Alliance of Wisconsin. And Michael will tell us about the River Alliance's Clearwater Farms program, which works with farmers to develop aggressive and documentable improvements to on-farm water management. And Michael will be joined by David Trimner, who is a fourth-generation farmer and general manager of Mill-Trim Farms, a large dairy located in the Eau Plaine River watershed in Marathon County, just west of Athens. And working with River Alliance, Mill-Trim Farms became the first farm in North America to achieve certification on the rigorous Alliance for Water Stewardship's international standard, which I can shorten down and just say it's the equivalent of LEED certification for water management on a farm. And Michael and David will discuss the management plan implemented for Mill-Trim Farms and how this process can be implemented across whole watersheds and supply chains. And our previous programs on water quality issues have been popular, so please join us on March 3rd, and we'll have access to Zoom links available on the Chippewa Valley Sierra Club website and Facebook page.
Thank you, Ron. It's time now to introduce our speaker. We are truly honored to have Ron Eckstein with us this evening. He is a retired Wisconsin DNR wildlife biologist, worked for the DNR for 36 years and based at Rhinelander. He worked on forest habitat and forest biodiversity issues, as well as eagle and osprey recovery and wild rice conservation. Currently, he volunteers as a board member for Wisconsin's Green Fire, which he'll tell us a bit about, and the North Woods Land Trust. He is chair of the Wildlife and Forest Conservation Affairs Committees for the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society and Wisconsin's Green Fire. He serves on Wisconsin DNR's Silviculture Guidance Team, the Governor's Council on Forestry's Sound Forestry Committee, and the Wisconsin Institute on Climate Change Impacts Forestry Work Group. And you thought you guys were busy. He and his wife live near Rhinelander, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ron Eckstein. Thank you.
Well,
Ron, you'll have to.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I think you can key up the talk right away, and we'll get going.
I'm on it.
Okay.
Here we go. You
So
should be
Wisconsin,
seen.
there we go. Thank you. So Wisconsin's Green Fire Voices for Conservation. Tonight, we're going to talk about forests at risk. A little bit about Green Fire. We're about 2.5 years old, almost 3 years old organization now. We began because of the Walker administration in Wisconsin, going away from science and conservation, environmental protection. We have about 450 members in the state. About 100 of those are resource professionals, many retirees who want to continue their public service in conservation and environmental protection. And we have a small staff. Fred Clark is our executive director, Terry Dalton, our president. And we have a small staff, but most of the work is done by what we call work groups. We have 8 of those. We have experts, mostly again, retirees, professional people that worked in water quality, air quality, climate, energy, wetlands, and wildlife. And my particular role is in public lands and forestry. Okay, next slide. And our mission for Green Fire is we support the conservation legacy of Wisconsin by promoting science-based management. So we're all about science-based management. What we try to do is work with agencies and with groups to provide the best possible information. A lot of our professional members have long-term experience working with agencies, whether it's the Forest Service or DNR or Environmental Protection Agency, university system, educators, folks like that. And we can use that experience because we know the ins and outs of agencies and how they work to promote conservation. Okay, next slide. And of course, the conservation legacy of Wisconsin, a lot of these folks you recognize, Gaylord Nelson, John Muir, and Sigurd Olson, and Alda Leopold, and so forth. Next slide. Want to continue that legacy, especially Alda Leopold with the land ethic. Our name Green Fire comes from an essay that he wrote about when he was a young man working with the Forest Service in the Southwest, and the goal was to get rid of all the wolves out of a mountain area to protect the deer. And he shot some of those wolves and he watched the green fire dying in the wolves' eyes. And later on, he realized that that was a mistake, that the deer need the wolves and the mountain needs the wolves, and they all have to work together. Okay, next slide. So what I focus on is silviculture, forest habitat, and forest biodiversity. We're in the Forestry Group, but we're not really about boards and cords and things like that. It's silviculture, which is tending of forests and trees, forest habitat for wildlife, and forest biodiversity when you add all the different plants and animals that occur in a forest. Okay, next slide. So just an overview of Wisconsin. Although I'm a wildlife biologist, I'm not going to talk about wildlife much. Instead, I focus on wildlife habitat, particularly in forests. So if you look at Wisconsin's forest wildlife, or the plants and animals that live in Wisconsin's forests, about 350 terrestrial vertebrate species. So these are animals that live on the land, not fish, that have a backbone. And so most of these are birds, over 200 species of birds, about 75 different kinds of mammals, and reptiles and amphibians that live in Wisconsin forests. About 30 major tree species in Wisconsin forests, especially in the North Woods, about 1,400 higher plants, many thousands of insects. And the key here is that of those 350 kinds of species, plus all the trees and the plants and all the insects, the whole works, the biodiversity, require different kinds of habitats in forests. Some do very, very well in very, very young forests, almost no trees or park grassland. Some do well in middle-aged forests, some do well in old growth forests. And so to conserve the full range of biodiversity in Wisconsin forests, we have to look at all the forest conditions that occur in Wisconsin, from young to old, from pines to maples and everything in between. Okay, next slide. So let's look at the pre-settlement forests first to take a brief view of where we were and then how we got there. So if you look at the map and you see all in the southern Wisconsin and the southwest Wisconsin, all that brown, those are the oak forests. These are, the darkest brown is bur oak and a lighter brown is white oak and then some black oak mixed in. This is a combination of sort of grasslands, prairies, oak savannas, oak openings, oak woodlands, and oak forest. All of that brown area in Wisconsin that you see there are fire-dependent species of trees. Those oak forests developed and evolved with fire, mostly set by Native Americans and then early settlers. The kind of the red and orange and yellow areas all around the state that you see are the pine areas where pines were dominant in the pre-settlement vegetation. The yellow is the white pine, and the red is the red pine, and the orange is jack pine. And these two are fire-dependent species. The jack pine, short rotation fires every 40, 50 years, stand replacing fire. Any place you see orange on the map there, that was fire dominated. And most of the red also, the red pine. The yellow was a little different. These were older forests, the white pine, and fires came through maybe every couple hundred years, maybe periodic ground fires that kept the pines there, but not as severe as with the, not as frequent a fire as with the oaks or with the jack pine. The green areas, there is, especially in northern Wisconsin area, the different colors of green and kind of a U shape there were the tremendous old growth maple, basswood, hemlock, yellow birch forests. And these were not fire dependent at all. These what were managed by nature was called gap phase management, where periodic windstorms that blew down maybe a little, you know, an area the size of a house or maybe a couple acres or occasionally a tornado, things like this were the main factors that influenced the forest. So these forests were really the true old growth forests of Wisconsin, the maple, basswood, hemlock, yellow birch forests. There were pines, white pines mixed in there too with those forests, but generally they worked on a gap phase kind of type ecosystem. Small disturbances. Many trees lived many hundreds of years old. The forests themselves stayed in place for literally thousands of years after the glacier left, without a major disturbance. In the eastern part of Wisconsin, you see some blue there. That's where beech was a major component of the forest. And if you look in far western Wisconsin, a kind of light tan color. In southern Wisconsin, some of the prairies. But so you had about half the state forests were in the pre-settlement condition, somewhat dependent or mostly dependent on fire, and about the other half of the forests that weren't. And they had this gap phase condition where minor disturbances with long periods of no disturbance occurred. And if you look at the map there, you know, the state was a lot of forest in the state, and we'll keep that in mind. Of about 30 kinds of trees that exist on major trees in Wisconsin forest, about 10 of them, 10 species require fire or require some kind of open condition, full sun to grow. You can think of aspen and jack pine and red pine and many of those species, they require full sun to really do well. About 15 species require partial sun to grow well. And about 5 species can grow really in the shade. So you can think about hemlock and white cedar and sugar maple can grow in deep shades and still survive. Okay, next slide. If you look closer at some of these pre-settlement maps, you know, it wasn't giant blocks of pure forest. The tan here is kind of in the Northwest Sands, was really open. The darkest green was really closed forest. So it was, you know, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the forest, even in the pre-settlement forest. It wasn't really giant solid blocks of one type of forest. But in general, that previous map showed the pre-settlement conditions, okay? And of course, we know what happened. The whole plan was to convert the northern forest to agriculture. From about the mid 1850s up to about 1930, the plan was the forest got to go, ag is going to be king. And that happened. In the lifetime of a lumberjack, they were gone. Okay, next slide. And part of that was the wildfires. Many areas of the Northwoods of Wisconsin in general burnt over during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And sometimes the fire burnt once, sometimes twice, some areas 3 times. And many times the seed source for many of the conifers and trees that require seeds to develop were just gone. And so the forest changed just dramatically. The cutting and the fire were the giant impacts on the northern forest, okay? And agriculture. So agriculture came all over the state, and much of the area of eastern Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin converted from forest to agriculture, okay? And urbanization. Today, of course, we have large cities, especially in southeast Wisconsin. This is Rhinelander in northern Wisconsin. And so urban development also impacted large areas of forest, okay? So here's a forest of today. For the most part in the Northwoods, all the green is forest, all the yellow is agriculture. So the Northwoods forest did grow back starting in about 1928 when people finally realized the Northwoods was not going to be agriculture, that wasn't going to work, and for a variety of reasons, so forests started regrowing. You can see the green in the central Wisconsin forest there. That also, a lot of sandy soils there that weren't good for agriculture, so forestry turned. And in southwestern Wisconsin, western and southwestern Wisconsin, you see the mix of green and yellow in the driftless area where the oak forests that survived grew, but the ag was in the valleys and on the hilltops, and the forests were mostly on the side hills. And so a lot of forest disappeared and is no longer there. We still have about 17 million acres of forest. The area of forest from 1983 to present did increase in the state because of agriculture abandonment and forest and ag lands reverting to forest. But it's been pretty steady. The amount of new development in the state where forest is converted to urban settings and roads and a little bit of new agriculture, and the amount of old agriculture reverting back to forest is about even currently. It's pretty steady. We're losing a little bit in the last few years, but pretty steady in the long term. The new forests, though, all that green on this map, the forests of the state, are way different than the pre-settlement forests and in many areas. One of the big problems is simplification. By simplification, we mean that the tree species diversity is way reduced from the original forests throughout the state. And the complexity of the forests, the structure of forests, the relationship to small to big trees and coarse woody debris and snags and things like that are completely different than the original forests. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit here at Forest at Risk is this idea of simplification of forests and how to deal with that. I'm going to talk a little bit as we go on about fragmentation. And this is really apparent, of course, throughout east central Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, where you just see just little forest remnants there, wood lots and things like that. And this fragmentation has terrible impacts on biodiversity and wildlife habitat in that part of the state. And we'll just touch on later on about pests, pathogens, invasive species, the climate, and things like that, but mostly talk about simplification. Okay, next slide. So composition and structure. We can organize our thoughts about how forests and biodiversity and wildlife habitat all interact by thinking about composition and structure. So composition is simply tree species diversity. With high composition, many different tree species, forests are much more resilient and have many more wildlife species and are better for biodiversity than simple forests, which just have 1 or 2 or 3 tree species in them. And structure is really how the different elements of a forest, from big logs on the forest floor, a shrub layer, medium-sized trees, big snag trees, half-dead trees, giant trees, super canopy trees, all these kind of things. So with an increased structure, again, that adds to biodiversity at all levels of plants and animals. So we'll talk about compositions and structure, okay? And the next slide. So let's look at the Northwoods that I'm most familiar with as an example. Currently in the Northwoods, about 30% of the forest is maple basswood, the so-called northern hardwoods. So maple basswood dominate, but other things like yellow birch and hemlock are there, but those are very rare. They've been eliminated for the most part. So maple basswood, sometimes sugar maple, red maple is an associate, white ash is an associate, but that's on the way out. Elm used to be an associate. That's almost all gone now. But 30% maple basswood. Maple basswood are those forests that have this kind of gap phase analysis where they're not fire dependent, and management is more through single tree type look or groups of small trees rather than, you know, clear cutting type management. I'm not going to talk about the wetlands much unless you have questions later. About 30% of the Northwoods are forested wetlands, white cedar, black spruce, tamarack. About 20% of the north is aspen. And we know that aspen is an early successional species. It really became abundant after the big fires. It seeded in and became much more dominant by 1920s, 1930s. It was up to 40% of the forest was aspen and aspen birch, but now down to 22%, but still a good percentage of the Northwoods. Only 10% are the pines, white, red, and jack pine. And jack pine is really declining now. It became a little more abundant, but now it's declining rapidly. Red pine is kind of stable because of plantations, and white pine is slowly increasing, but both red and white pine declined dramatically after the big cut. Still only about 10% of the Northwoods. About 5% of the Northwoods are oak forests. So northern red oak and called scrub oak, which is kind of a smaller, scrubbier type oak that occurs on sandy soils. But mostly we're concerned about northern red oak, but only 5% of the forest. Hemlock, which was once a dominant across all that green area in northern Wisconsin, declined by like 98%. And it currently only is about 2% of the Northwoods and just barely hanging on. Lots of problems with reproduction because of deer and other factors. And then all other types, white birch and white spruce and pine barrens and all those other kinds are just a tiny percentage of the Northwoods. But we're going to talk a little bit about the maple forest because that's okay. Maple forest, the oak forest, pine forests, and the aspen forest. So let's look at the forests as they develop. These are the stages of forest development. If there was a complete clear cut, they would go from stand initiation after a disturbance, a clear cut or a fire or a big windstorm to blew everything down, through stem exclusion and just growing. If you had no management attention, they just grew. And finally into the old category. That stem exclusion stage is where almost all of our northern hardwood, white pine, and oak forests are. That stage can last up to from 80 to maybe 140 years old, where there's a lot of competition among the trees. Very few of our forests are still into the next stage, that demographic transition, where some light is getting into the forest floor and young trees are coming up. And again, the old growth, the really old forests are less than 1% of our current forest. And of course, animals, all those different kinds of 350 species of birds and mammals and reptiles, amphibians, insects, and all that. They live in all these age classes of the forest. We in Green Fire are particularly interested in the very, very young forests and the very, very old forests and their restoration and management, okay? So here's an example of the barrens habitat they're interested in, Forest Service, Moqua Barrens, and up in Bayfield County, and big expanses of these very fire dependent, very early successional shrublands and stuff. Very interested in maintaining for a wide variety of species that like these forests, okay? Really young forest, you can hardly tell it's a forest. And jack pine. Jack pine's rapidly declining. The fires are gone. We really don't have fires anymore that maintains it. And so scenes like this are really a smile to managers. Young jack pine, think Kirtland's warblers and species like that, okay? And on the end of the spectrum, the old growth forests is where our concerns are. Will we allow some of our 80 to 90-year-old maple, pine, oak forests develop old growth characteristics, or will we manage them not to develop those characteristics? And so this is the state natural area Elva Lake Hemlock Hardwood Forest in Vilas County. Okay, next. And here's Tenderfoot Lake in Vilas County. To the left of the screen in the south is a large nature conservancy preserve, Tenderfoot Preserve. And it's a wonderful 200-plus-year-old old growth forest that's been preserved by the Nature Conservancy. One of the few examples that exist, okay? So let's look at northern hardwoods quickly. See a nice northern hardwood forest here, maple, basswood. But what you don't see are any conifers mixed in. The white pine is mostly gone, red pine's gone. Yellow birch you don't see in there because it was high graded years ago. So this forest is about 80, 90 years old. And normally it'd be this gap phase, small disturbances. And the question is, how should we manage this forest? Should we let it grow older and go into older age classes, into that demographic transition and finally into old growth? Or do we keep it young and younger, keep it in that 80, 90-year-old stage for intensive timber harvest? Okay, next. So you're looking in the understory. This particular stand is maybe 60 years old. It's very poor wildlife habitat. There is some coarse woody debris, not much. There's Pennsylvania sedge, which inhibits forest reproduction. It's full of earthworms, which are terrible for understory plants. It has no shrubs. It has no large trees. Okay, next. Here's a better example of a northern hardwood forest that we'd like to see in management, a wide variety of trees. So the composition is improved. Many different kinds of tree species, from maples and hemlocks and all kinds of trees, and the structure is improved. You can imagine birds, all kinds of different birds living in this kind of habitat, okay? And of course, the rare species in the hardwood forest, the hemlock is almost gone, and any kind of stands of a hemlock, we try to say we need to protect those and maintain them in the landscape, as well as yellow birch. Also was once much more abundant. It was really high graded during World War II for the war effort and airplane propellers and things like that. And so we need to keep the composition of our northern hardwood forests intact, keep the hemlock, keep the yellow birch, the rare white pines that occur, things like that. Okay, next. And the structure, coarse woody debris. Much of the biodiversity of forests really is within the bottom 3 feet of the forest floor, from the duff layer and the plants and animals right on the forest floor, the coarse woody debris, these logs, and then the small shrubs and small shrubs and small trees. You know, like 60% of the biodiversity occurs right there on the forest floor. And so we have to keep that robust, okay? You know, the small things make forests go. You know, all the microorganisms and fungi and so forth really make the forest go, and we have to pay attention to those, okay? And there's a big old tree that's half dead. This is a smile on my face. The tree is large. It has large cavities and dentries. 61 species of animals require dens or snags or half-dead trees. The larger the tree, the better. Snags in particular, a completely dead tree standing there in our temperate zone is not long for this world. It falls over because we have wet conditions and roots rot away and it just falls over. But half-dead trees, especially large ones, are really the golden thing that we look for in structure in these forests, okay? And here, what I would consider a happy looking forest with a variety of tree species, a variety of structure in the forest. Again, good for biodiversity if we can make forests look like this, okay? And large trees. This is a big old giant yellow birch tree. And about halfway up there, you can see just a little bit of a nest sticking from under the bark. That's a brown creeper nest, and they nest under the bark of these large yellow birch. So large trees are important. Okay, next. Let's look at pine forests. Again, pine forests in the North Woods, white pine, red pine forests are what we're talking about, are about 80 to 95 years old. It became established after the big cuts. And they occur again on only 10% of the landscape, so they're relatively rare. And here then the question is, for these 80 to 90-year-old forests, what is their future? Are we going to try to regenerate them, to grow them back from little trees, or are we going to manage them into even older age classes? Okay, next. And the same kind of thing. Here's a forest of red pine that this was planted from seed in 1913. This forest was planted at Star Lake in Vilas County by one of the first state foresters. And you can see after over 100 years old, with no thinning and no management, these are really old trees, but you wouldn't think, well, this is an old growth forest. That's the concern with densely packed trees. Very poor habitat because of no shrub layer. And so, although somewhat pretty, biodiversity is low. Next. And here's a same age forest in the same county, red pine, same plantation, but it was a managed forest where sunlight can get in and you can see the shrub and small tree development. And again, wildlife habitat and biodiversity is much improved if you let some sun into these dense pine forests. Okay, next. Same with the white pine forests, snags, coarse woody debris, light coming in for the young pines while maintaining the older ones. Next. And again, large old trees, some snags, young trees in the foreground. This is great management for pine forests, white pine forests. Next. And even into the older growth, this is a really old red pine forest, over 200 years old. It hasn't been managed, but this one has a little more diversity. There's at least a shrub layer on the ground there, and some deciduous trees mixed in. Next. My favorite tree is the white pine, and I'm on a mission to restore white pine and restore the older white pine forest in the North Woods. So next. Got to speed up here a little bit. Nice white pine forest, especially on lakeshore zones. Next. Let's talk about aspen. Aspen forest began after the Great Fires, became very abundant. Now have declined. They're about 22% of the northern forest. Next. Here's a poor example of aspen forest. All this gray area in spring are aspen trees in Lincoln County Forest. The Great Fires took away all the conifers, all the hemlock. This was once old growth maple, sugar maple, hemlock, yellow birch forest, was completely clear cut, was burnt over several times. And now we have aspen without hardly any conifers. Next. And a much better forest in Vilas County. The gray and the yellow are different kinds of aspen, trembling and big-tooth aspen. The green are white pines and red pines mixed in, and the orange are oak trees. So again, much on a landscape scale, much more diverse forest. It's managed to open up, to let the sun in, to allow the aspen to grow, but it has all these other elements of composition and structure that makes it a much better forest. Next. And again, keeping pines in even age management is very important. Next. Coarse woody debris, next. Snags, next. And our mature aspen forest can be quite beautiful, especially if you have pines and firs and things mixed in, and oaks. Next. And oaks. Every animal whose mouth is big enough eats an acorn. They're extremely important for biodiversity, our oak forests. Next. Here's an oak forest in Vilas County. The orange are a mature oak stand. This is again an 80, 90, 95-year-old, right in that category stand of oak. Oak is a fire-dependent species. They can't compete with the maples, and especially red maple. You know, and so if just left alone, over time, this forest would convert to maple. So that there has to be techniques to manage oak, and it's a big problem all across Wisconsin, especially in the driftless area, is that maples are taking over the oak forest. And so all kinds of techniques, you know, fire once did it. We don't have fire anymore. So we have to use logging and herbicides and hand cutting and whatever possible to keep the red maple and sugar maple at bay, to keep the oaks in place and regenerating with new oaks. Okay, next. Here's some young oak, dense young oak that's very uncommon in the state, and it's a real problem. Very time consuming and expensive to get this oak growing, but we really do have to do it. Next. And again, leaving reserve trees is always important. Next. And especially in southern Wisconsin, the oak openings with these beautiful open grown bur oaks and white oaks, you know, several hundred, 300-400-year-old trees that once dotted our southern Wisconsin landscape. We really want to restore those whenever possible. Next. Okay, so the forests at risk, you can, what I tried to get across is there can be the risk of management in which we harvest forests in the wrong way to simplify them, to reduce composition and reduce structure, or the risk of no management, particularly in our oak forests, where we need the management to get the competition at bay and manage for the oak. So there's the two risks are either we manage them right or wrong, or we don't manage them right or wrong. Okay, next. And again, simplification is really the big problem. The fragmentation is really a problem in the southern part of the state. The answer there is to accumulate more forest over time, to connect fragments and to make them into bigger spots of forest. Okay, next. We'll talk about insect pests, deer, pathogen, invasive plants, all are putting our forests at risk. The goal here is that we need to fund the universities and DNR Division of Forestry to keep the pest managers and the scientists and foresters well-funded and well-staffed to keep attacking and researching insect pests and pathogens, and of course, invasive plants, particularly in southern Wisconsin, buckthorn and honeysuckle and things that are just really making it hard to grow forests again because of their dense understories. We'll talk about deer in a second. Okay, next. Okay, for climate, we'll just touch on it. It turns out that to make forests, you know, the climate is changing rapidly, and forests take hundreds of years to change. So what we need are resilient forests. And to have resilient forests, we need diverse forests. So again, the same composition and structure that's important in biodiversity is also the key for climate, to making forests resilient to climate change. We can also mitigate the impacts of carbon dioxide. Of course, the answer is we just have to stop using fossil fuels. That's of course the answer. But forests can help mitigate carbon dioxide by taking it out of the atmosphere and storing it as wood and is in the soil and roots and so forth. Fast-growing young forests sequester carbon rapidly. They rapidly take on carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into wood. old forest and old growth forests store carbon very well. So it seems that the best combination is a combination of fast growing young forests in some areas, in some conditions, and old forests that store carbon. So get it out of the atmosphere and store it as long as possible. Okay, next. Here's deer. We can talk all day on deer. They have severe impacts on forests, just severe, outstandingly severe. This is a forester. You can see a kind of a fence behind him. That's a deer fence in Bakersfield County. You can see behind him the reproduction of oaks and birches and things are like 8 feet tall. In front of them is where the deer can live, and there's hardly anything. I can't emphasize enough how much deer can impact forest regeneration. Okay, next. And our planning tools are what we have a thing called the landscape ecosystems. This map shows the various landscape ecosystems. So DNR has a landscape ecosystem handbook. It has a wildlife action plan and a forest action plan. Those 3 documents can help everybody, nonprofits and everybody, to look at where you live in forests of interest. And those documents kind of summarize by these ecological landscapes what's out there, what's important, kind of all the things I've been talking about. Okay, next. And we have to talk to these folks. This is a group of foresters that I worked with for many years when I was working. Some really good fellows there, knew what they were doing. About half of them really did a great job. A few of them there were just sawdust brains, and all they could do is cut trees. So we have a mix, and the best is to get the best information to these foresters so they can do the best job possible. Okay, next. And here's a forester in the Bayfield County forest, and you can see in the background some small trees marked in orange to cut. They're doing a thinning, and they agreed in this case to not cut a whole bunch of these big, gigantic old growth yellow birch that were sprinkled through the forest. And that's the kind of positive thing. They saw the value of these old trees for biodiversity, and we're not cutting them. Okay, next. And these folks, is a group of Nature Conservancy, Forest Stewards Guild, university folks, DNR foresters, research scientists, all came together to look at a forest, and that's what it's going to take. All these groups really getting together to get the best possible information and how to manage the forest. Okay, next. Got to give a plug for the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program. I know the Sierra Club supports it. It's just critical that it's introduced again and extended for 10 years. The land acquisition program for DNR and nonprofits to buy forest land, to block in forest, to stop fragmentation, to add to our parks and wildlife areas. So that's really important. Next. And I think this will be our last slide. This is a forest of private land in the Lac du Flambeau Indian Reservation in Vilas County. Our Northwoods Land Trust are talking to the landowners. This big peninsula in the middle of this crooked lake, and Eichwalton Lake in the background. And you know, what is going to be the fate of that big giant peninsula there? It's about a 90-year-old second growth forest. Is the trajectory going to be to older forest? Is it going to be divided into lots? Is it going to be partially clear cut? What's going to happen? And so I think that's in our hands in the lifetime of the managers of the forest we now have in DNR and the Forest Service here in the state, and the private landowners. The fate of the oak forests, the fate of the mature pine forest, the fate of the maturing maple forests are really in their hands. What is going to be the trajectory? And so I went a little over time here, but we're ready for chat questions if we have some.
Great. We have a couple questions, and I encourage people to add questions in you have. So the first one is, what are the impacts of invasive species such as buckthorn and honeysuckle? Our experience is that they can overtake the understory in oak forests.
Absolutely, they do and have in much of southern Wisconsin, not everywhere. They just, you know, you can't regenerate a forest because they're in the way. And once they become established as, 2 or 3 inch diameter stems, it's just really, really tough and expensive to get rid of them. So you can't get natural forbs, everything from lilies and everything else growing on the forest floor. And you can't get the young trees growing because it's just dense understory of especially the shrubs, buckthorn and honeysuckle. Terrible problem. There are incentives to help landowners, but there just isn't enough incentive from government agencies or different programs to do it. You can do a little bit here and a little bit there, but the problem is immense.
Great. Could you briefly describe silviculture?
The silviculture is just it's a word that means the tending and caring of trees. So it's the culture of, like horticulture is the tending and caring of, garden plants, things like that. And silviculture is tending of trees. And what we want to do in Green Fire is make sure that as foresters work on, and there's a guide in Wisconsin, it's called Wisconsin's Guide to Silviculture. It's the handbook for managing Wisconsin's forests that DNR puts out. And so we want to make sure that that giant handbook, it's like 800 pages long for all the different kinds of trees and different conditions. And it's real technical, but we want to ensure that the quote unquote silviculture handbook includes elements of wildlife habitat and biodiversity. So that's our goal. That's why I serve on the silviculture committee, and I'm the voice for biodiversity and wildlife habitat, along with forest products industry and landowners and everybody else. And so, yeah, that's silviculture, and we need it to be a broad definition to not only include just trees, but the habitat and all the biodiversity.
Thank you. The next two are kind of related, so I'll ask them to you together. What should homeowners do to help promote healthy urban forests, and what should a landowner do if they want to work to restore forested land?
Yeah, for urban forests, of course, they're more and more important. And urban forests have multiple uses. Social justice is a big one. Many of our, like if you look at inner Milwaukee, even look at the city of Superior, quite a few larger cities in Wisconsin, really, especially in poor neighborhoods, just lack tree cover. And they do all kinds of things from cooling to providing, mental health and so forth. So some cities have a forestry department who are actively managed. Some cities like Rhinelander is, they don't like trees because they ruin the sidewalk and they have to deal with branches and so I think, yeah, urban, there's a whole group of folks within DNR, the urban forestry section within DNR. If you go to DNR's website and forestry and click on urban forestry, there's an urban forest council, and you can really get into the urban thing. We need urban places are wonderful places to do a lot of tree planting. There's a lot of opportunity there. As far as homeowners, each individual landowner should look at, I would say a forest management plan. Typically a forest management plan is a forester coming out and saying which trees you need to cut, but it can be much more than that. Looking at what tree species diversity you have and getting rid of invasive whenever possible. I own 12 acres, and on my 12 acres, I have every little 3-foot hemlock shrub fenced because the deer would eat them. So I do that. So I want hemlock to grow. I've trimmed and made some canopy gaps, cutting away some aspens and some maples to allow some oak trees to grow and get bigger. So I'm trying to increase the composition by planting hemlock and planting some cedars and protecting them from deer, and making sure that rare trees, like I have 2 yellow birch trees on 12 acres. I really want to save those trees and make sure that they grow and provide some growing space. The National Wildlife Federation, as you know, if you go to National Wildlife, they have just tons of stuff to do with landowners with both forests and yards and things like that.
Great. Lots of resources. So this is a good, very current question. With deer being a major problem, what are your thoughts on the role of wolves in Wisconsin?
Well, certainly wolves have a role in Wisconsin, and from a wide variety. They're a native species that we should have here. The big question is, how many? That's always the big question. And within Green Fire, if you go to our website, wigreenfire.org, you can see a wolf white paper that some of our wolf biologists that are retired wolf folks wrote. Adrian Weideman, you may know, has been the wolf biologist forever, and it really was helpful. He wrote most of that paper, and it calls for using a science approach. There's something like 1,100 wolves in the winter in Wisconsin, and what should the right number be? Some groups say it should be 300. That's just low. A lot of biologists are thinking maybe 800 number, which would keep them as a viable species and keep them in the landscape in good numbers. The legislature has mandated a hunting season, so there will be a hunting season. And the question with any hunting season, you have a goal: how many wolves you want, how many you want to harvest, how do you harvest them? All those questions are very, very controversial. So, but if you want the best information from us, go to wigreenfire.org and look for the wolf white papers. A lot of information.
That's great. Can you elaborate on your comment about earthworms and any remedies?
Yeah, not many remedies. People are surprised that earthworms are a problem. And it turns out in southern Wisconsin, earthworms are native, but in most of northern Wisconsin, they're not. They're not native. There were no native worms after the glaciers scraped everything away. There are some aquatic worms in the Northwoods that woodcock like and eat along wetland edges and things like that. But in the forest, there were no worms. And so the northern forests developed, they have this duff layer. And in the duff layer, which can be maybe 4 to 6 inches thick, all the leaves and halfway decomposed things, that's where all the biodiversity occurs. Anything from all the small mammals, mice and shrews and things like that live in that duff layer. Tons and tons of arthropods live in that duff layer. All the plants and ants and trilliums and all that stuff need that duff layer. What the earthworms do is they take that whole thing and they put it underground. So it helps the soil, but now you just have bare spots. And on the bare spots grow things like Pennsylvania sedge, which is a native species, but it's just, deer don't like it and not much eats it. It looks green, it looks pretty, but it's just kind of useless for biodiversity. So earthworms really have a giant influence. They're not everywhere, but they're moving on. The best people at that, if you go to the University of Minnesota at Duluth and Google on earthworms, a fellow there has been studying them forever, and there's tons of good papers and information on earthworms.
Wow. I'm going to combine the last two questions. So now's your chance to stick something in the chat after this one, if you have a question you've been hoping for. So it's both on what action can be taken. So first part is, in addition to the stewardship fund, are there any particular things that you think would be helpful for us to lobby for in the state budget, or beyond that, any particular regulations you'd like to see changed? And then this other question is on the federal side, the Biden administration just announced a commitment to protecting 30% of the United States lands and oceans by 2030. Do you think that provides any opportunities for us in Wisconsin to protect our forests?
Well, the last one first, yeah, that would be up to, that's a great, we have great hopes for the Biden administration on the national level, taking back some of the good ground on national forests, on national monuments, on everything from the Arctic refuge to the Tongass National Forest. All these things got to be put back in place. They're just horrible. You know, the last administration had executive orders ordering the Forest Service to, you know, up their cut, you know, beyond the forest plan type thing. It's just horrible. So we have great hopes for that. And the 30%, that's great. In the West, there's opportunity to do that because they have a ton of public land. In the East, we don't. And so there, in the East, more protection is going to be a combination of things like land acquisition and getting large landowners to, you know, do conservation easements and things like that. And I'm lost. I lost the first part of it.
Oh, sure. The first part was then state action. So anything that would be good for us to lobby for on the state budget or regulations you'd like to see change.
Well, what we're going to be looking at with Green Fire is stewardship program and gathering waters, and you know, is really spearheading that. But there are 50 conservation organizations. I'm sure the Sierra Club's involved with that, from Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever. Just every conservation organization is promoting it. But it's a tough budget year because of the virus. And so, you know, some legislators are just not going to want to spend any money. But stewardship is really critically important. As far as legislation, back about 6 years ago, the legislature in a budget session, without a single public hearing, in the middle of the night, on a vote on the budget, changed the state law concerning state forests, the 500,000 acres that are state DNR forests. And each one of these forests had a management plan that was really pretty good. And 5-6 years ago, they just said, no, 75% of all state forests, those 500,000 acres that are called state forests, must be managed to maximize timber production. And this is just wrong. It just went way wrong from what the master plans had said for these places. So that eventually needs to be overturned. It's not consistent with the other statutes governing state forests. We talk about biodiversity and multiple use and all these things. And then suddenly there's a phrase, oh, and 75% must be maximized timber production, which is really wrong. I don't think there's any hope for that unless we get another blue part of government. Maybe there might be some hope, but right now I don't think there's any hope for that. Other than that, the Division of Forestry, really the DNR Division of Forestry, they're the ones that do all the work on state lands and all the pests and all the pathogens. So their budget really has to be robust in order for them to do the work. For them to do the oak work that's needed, they need more staff and a bigger budget. For them to do many of the cultural treatments that's needed for silviculture to increase biodiversity, you know, they just have to do it. A lot of times we criticize them because they do clear cuts and they do things like that. But in the long run, with the best information, they do a good job. Uncharacteristic maybe, or unusual, another big player in forests that's really important is the forest products industry. All the loggers and the mills, because we have a strong forest products industry, because we have sawmills that take saw timber, because we have pulp mills that take pulp, we can actually have a market for the work that needs to be done, restoring oak forests and savannas and doing, you know, partial cuttings. And so the forest products industry should remain strong, we're trying to make them a strong partner in our work because they have the machines and equipment and know how to do that work.
That is it for questions. I'll hand it back to you, Karen. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who submitted a question.
So I just want to thank Ron. That was really good. I learned a lot, and I have some woods, and I'm learning more about managing that. Thank you for all the good works you do. And we'll go to the website and learn more.
Okay.
And thanks everybody for coming. It was a great turnout. We're really excited when we do this again next month. Did you want to say anything, Richard?
No, I've just, again, thank you for everybody that showed up. Thank you to Ron for the fantastic presentation. And I think we didn't mention Eleanor. We should have mentioned Eleanor because I think she made the original contact and had the idea to have you come and talk. So she's another part of our team. Thanks to all of you. And we wish you a safe drive home.